everyone. Welcome to BookMachine Unplugged, Talking Audio. And this is in the month that, would have seen the Love Audio campaign. Obviously, life has got in the way of that. So I believe that's happening in September. However, there has never been a better time to talk audio. So I'm really excited you've all joined us tonight, and we've got literally a packed house. We've completely sold out. Now, if you want to tweet or post anything on Instagram, the hashtag as ever is BookMachine. Now, before I hand over to our host, Louise, I have a few thanks to make. First of all, to Team Unplugged. They're a group of publishing professionals who work in a variety of different publishing houses in different sectors who help spread the word. And we really appreciate the work they do, helping us to let a wider range of people come along to these events. So thank you. Also, we couldn't make this series happen without our sponsoring partners. And particularly at the moment, we appreciate their support because, you know, it's been a challenging time. First of all, I want to tell you about Ingram Content Group. The world is reading, and Ingram Content Group connects readers with content in all forms. Their services include digital and physical book distribution, digital e-learning, and print on demand. So I guess they've been a bit busy recently. Ingram also makes content distribution seamless, and they have comprehensive services for publishers, retailers, libraries, and educators. Thank you. You guys have been with us all this year. We really appreciate your support. Now, Getty Images, few of you might have heard of them. They are the world's biggest creator and distributor of digital content, and they provide high quality imagery across every aspect of creative, editorial, and archive. They can advise you on all aspects of cost-effective licensing solutions and also how you can access the world's biggest commercial archive. And if you want to contact Michael, he can provide further information and talk to you about how they can help. Now, we'd like to welcome a new sponsoring partner, and that is Glassbox from Thirsty Group. So they have a product that would be of particular interest to audio publishers. Glassbox is their sales tool that enables publishers to sell their content directly and securely through a range of different channels. So that could be your own website, social media channels, on your blog, or even the author networks, communities, and platforms. Customers click the button to buy the ebook or the audiobook and are directed to download the Glassbox app on either iOS or Android. Then the content is waiting for them once they log in using the same email they used to buy the book. So there's no setup cost, no monthly cost, and just a flat 20% commission rate on any sales gained. And the onboarding process is really seamless and quick, literally a few days, using automated feeds that get the content and metadata in situ. So if you want to find out more, contact Finn Kirkland for a demo, and welcome again. Really pleased to have you on board. Now I'm going to hand over to Louise. Louise is our host, and she is a member of the editorial board for BookMachine. Louise is also audio editor at Little Brown Books, and many of you will know she's a passionate advocate for audio. She's chaired a London branch of SYP and been involved in cross-industry audio initiatives. And tonight she wants us to get below the headlines and consider how audio can shape publishing strategy more widely. I can't think of a better time to consider this. So without further ado, over to you, Louise.
Great, thanks so much, Suzanne, for that really lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see so many of you online and joining in from your homes during lockdown. So thank you all so much for coming. So what I am going to do is I'm just going to talk you through a little bit about what this event is about tonight and how we got to this stage and how we got to this discussion, really. So as you all know, audio is the fastest growing area of publishing within the UK today, and this has largely been aided by technological advances, whereas before, if you were listening to an audiobook, you'd have to go to your local library, get a CD, and libraries, I should add, are still a hugely important part of the audio industry. But now you have the option to download an app and listen to your audiobook on the go on your mobile phone. So last year we BookMachine held their first ever audio Unplugged panel event, and we used that really as an opportunity to focus on the here and now of audio publishing. So the conversation in audio publishing around AI and around virtual reality is a really prevalent one, and it is one that is continually talked about, and looking ahead to the future about how we can expand audio into different areas of technology. However, that talk last year, we really focused on the here and now. We kept our feet firmly on the ground and looked beyond the kind of the hype and the headlines about all these kind of amazing glowing figures and audio publishing, and really focused on actually what we were getting across the industry. And that was really illuminating. And we looked at marketing and editorial. We looked at everyone's different approaches to that, which was hugely illuminating from my perspective. And in many ways, this talk is a year on from now. And things have changed a little, but also, well, in the kind of quite an obvious sense, which quite a lot has changed in the last few months. But in terms of audio, things have changed a little, but some things are still the same. So I'm going to touch a little bit on that now. So while there are kind of wonderful examples across audio publishing of audiobooks outselling other formats, outselling the print, outselling ebooks, this has yet to be regularly the norm. So we have wonderful examples like Hachette, for example, where Alan Partridge's Nomad from Orion Audio really outperformed the other editions and really flew off the digital shelves, as it were, and that was fantastic to see. But we haven't really reached the point where we can automatically assume that that is always going to happen. And Hachette Audio myself, I published Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury into the audio market in the UK, and we worked really closely with the US team in order to achieve that. And I'm sure that you saw in the news at the time, Fire and Fury hugely exploded into the market and set off in sort of meteoric fashion, and ebooks and audiobooks were flying off the virtual shelves, and that was partly in part to, well, from the audio side of things, a fantastic narration from Halter Graham, the US recorded, but it was also initially because there was a shortage of print copies. However, a few weeks later, when we had more print copies in the store, we didn't have a physical copy limited, you know, in Waterstones, one per customer, as you may have seen reported in the news at the time. We got more print in, and audio and e still continue to sell really well. So these kind of anecdotal stories make me really optimistic about the growth of audio as a format in itself. Now, the question of lockdown. So it's been recently reported that publishers such as Penguin Random House and Hachette UK notice an initial spike in audio sales. Of course, we're all in lockdown, we're all at home, so the temptation to read a book just a click away can be quite overwhelming, certainly is for me. However, while that was kind of the original report, that kind of initial peak then sort of changed to kind of the ongoing growth of sales that we've just gradually seen across the audio publishing industry. And that kind of market growth has been sort of, from our perspective, quite relative to what the growth that we would have expected. So while there was that kind of big headline, that's sort of where we are more now. As a side note, just across, I just have to quickly kind of give a shout out, and I'm sure that the other panelists are going to say this as well, but our studios completely rose to the challenge of recording during lockdown. I really can't emphasize that enough. It was a really, I mean, nobody could have seen this coming, and they completely took it as business as usual. So we've still managed to record audiobooks during lockdown. We actually at Hachette just opened with studio, God, that's like 6 months ago now. We just opened a recording studio at Hachette, and they opened in January, and they're sending recording equipment to authors who are recording from home, who aren't able to travel. We've been able to send recording equipment to actors, and actors have really hit the ground running as well with setting up their own home studios and really facing that challenge head on. So, I mean, I think all of the panelists will be saying this tonight. I'm just bowled over by everything they've done, and that we've managed to still continue recording brilliant audiobooks to high standard. So while audio is booming, we do still have a little bit of a way to go. So as audio publishers, we're still learning from our consumers. However, while I have said that some things are kind of remaining the same, really exciting recent research does seem to suggest that female listeners are overtaking male listeners first time across audio. So when I had this talk last year, the split was something along the lines of 55% male to 45% female listener split, whereas now it's almost a complete reverse, which is incredible in the space of a year and is really testament to how quickly the audiobook market can move. The growth of the audiobook market has largely tracked the growth in podcasts over the course of the last decade, and this may well explain the growth in areas such as true crime. Over the last 5 years, that has really been an area that's taken off, and I've been at Little Brown for almost half a decade, and I've really seen that growth firsthand, as well as just general growth across the whole industry. Podcasts are often set as that kind of example, as being the gateway into audiobooks. And I think sometimes that can be a little bit misleading, because I think it can make some people outside the industry feel that, you know, audiobooks are kind of a separate segment off the rest of publishing, and sort of kind of away from traditional publishing and not really part of the same thing. However, this panel event will be really looking at how audiobooks can be seen as a gateway, not only of bringing new listening readers to the market, but also as improving growth in other areas across ebook and print as well, and looking at really of the impact on the audio publishing, of audio publishing on the industry today. So I am really hugely delighted to introduce you to our speakers tonight. So I'm now going to take the opportunity to introduce you to our wonderful speakers. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Videl. Videl Barkar has over 20 years media industry experience in both corporate and startup environments. He has worked in publishing for over a decade, first as director of the Ways of Words Literary Festival, then as the audio publisher for Penguin Random House, which he led an award-winning team across editorial, production and marketing to create the UK's leading audiobook publisher. He's had his hands full, I can tell you that. He is a member of the Cheltenham Literature Festival, advisory board and co-founder of Minotaur Productions. As global head of audio for Bookwire, Videl leads the international expansion of the company's rapidly growing audio business, from production through distribution of audiobooks and the development of flexible end-to-end solutions for publishers across all markets. Ruth Tross will be our next speaker tonight, is publishing director of Bookouture, a digital publisher of commercial fiction and, since May, non-fiction, which part of her remit is to oversee the company's audio publishing. She listens to audiobooks while walking, cooking, gardening, and usually, I'm told, at 1.3 times the speed, which is great because that packs in a lot of different audiobooks, and really exciting to hear from her and have that perspective coming from an ebook publisher. And Elise Italiaander is our final speaker for this evening. She has been in the audio industry for 7 years and actually has very unique experience because she previously worked as editorial content coordinator at Audible and is currently the audio and digital manager at Dorling Kingsley. She is a huge advocate for audiobooks, realising the potential they have to reach a wider audience while bringing the magic of story to those otherwise excluded. So on that note, we're going to start our conversation tonight with Videl. Over to you, Videl.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Louise. Hope everyone can hear me okay. It's really great to be here. And I think I'm just going to start for a few minutes. I know we're going to hear from two publishers, from Ruth and Elise. And I don't wear a publisher hat these days, but as Louise mentioned, I now work for Bookwire, who are in the digital distribution business for audiobooks. So Bookwire operates across a lot of different markets. It's originally from Germany, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we see across different markets, some of the similarities we see, and maybe some of the differences as well, and kind of what I feel like might be coming in the future in terms of audiobooks, and why we're all so excited about it, which of course we are, but I think there's always some interesting reasons. So I mean, why am I here? Why are we here talking about audio? And I think it's because, and I really do think this, we are still in the middle of this shift, which is actually, I think it's kind of like a once in a generation shift for audiences, for publishers, for authors, which is providing really an opportunity for stories to reach consumers and capture their attention in a landscape where so much attention is being consumed by non-book content, by video content, by all sorts of a lot of very, very short form media content. And I think audiobooks have shown that over the years, to be, proven to engage audiences more and more at an ever kind of growing size. And we've seen, as you mentioned, Louise, so many markets. Well, you mentioned the UK market specifically, which has been in double-digit growth for quite a few years now, and is certainly it's one of the most mature markets. So I think that's just fantastic. I think the last growth figure for the UK market I saw was 38%. That was 2019 versus 2018. I know some of these numbers are sometimes hard to really get a handle on, but we have to try and find some kind of guidelines. And that's a huge growth. The US market grew by 25% year on year, 2019 versus 2018. That's official statistics from the US APA Audio Publishers Association. The German market, which I think is probably the biggest audiobook market in Europe, that grew by similarly something like 25-26% last year. And then of course you have developing markets. So I think the really, really interesting ones are the Spanish and Latin American markets. So you have Spanish publishers, US based publishers publishing in Spanish, and then of course Latin America, Spanish speaking countries publishing in Spanish. So there's this incredibly new and growing very rapidly kind of Spanish publishing landscape. These all have distinct behaviors and types of stories and titles and length of content. Far too much detail for me to go into now, but I think one of the other key things that's driving this growth, of course, it's technology and it's smartphones, it's smart speakers, and really importantly, the digital retail landscape is more diverse now than it was a few years ago. You've got, of course, you have all the major players. You have Audible and Apple and Google. You have Kobo. You have services from the Nordics, focusing on all-you-can-eat consumption, so different kinds of business models such as Storytel and BookBeat. And then really interesting, you have also, maybe not so relevant yet in the UK, but certainly on the continent and in Germany, you have audiobooks being consumed on music streaming services like Spotify and Deezer. So all of this is fueling this growth and reaching consumers in different ways. Just a quick note on the kind of Corona effect and what we've seen at Bookwire. I think I'd echo what you said, Louise, that we've seen across Germany and Spanish markets particularly. We've seen there was definitely an uptick during those kind of last 2 months specifically. I think we saw in Germany in particular, there was lots of retail marketing campaigns by digital retailers. So through our business, we saw about 150% increase in download audio channels, and about 50% increase in streaming channels. Lots of children's titles, non-fiction as well. So there is a real mix. And in Germany, it's interesting that some publishers earn about 30 or 50% of their digital revenue from streaming services. In terms of where audio might be heading, I mean, it's a big question to ask, of course, and I hopefully in the Q&A we can talk about it a bit more. But I think a few of the things that we've been noticing, I mean, the first thing is that I think some ambitious audio publishers who might be starting in one region and publishing initially in one language are actually acquiring catalogs in other markets and moving into different languages. And I don't necessarily mean the big corporate groups necessarily who already have local offices. But for example, Saga Egmont, part of the Egmont group, they bought 2 Spanish language publishers. So they're entering the Spanish market, having been traditionally a Nordic publisher. So that's kind of something that I think we might see more of, because the expertise can be replicated across different markets. I think there's every sign that this kind of growth is going to continue. There are estimates that the global audiobook market will grow by about 25% this year. Of course, that's a very generic number, but I think that's across the US and Europe, and interestingly in China, which is a very often seen as something completely different. But I think we should take notice as well of what's going on in all the major and emerging markets. Some have even predicted that audiobooks, the audiobook market, if it keeps growing at the same trajectory every year, might possibly outgrow the ebook market. Now that's quite a prediction, and I don't know if that's going to happen, but it's interesting, especially if you think about the growth, like you said, Louise, of podcasts tracking audiobooks, and I think the podcast market is nowhere near finished in terms of its growth. And these two kind of worlds are also going to come closer together. I mean, in Europe, you have podcast companies like Podimo, who are monetizing podcasts. And so there's one, of course, different ways that podcasts could be monetized through advertising, but they could be monetized through a kind of premium access, in the same way that audiobooks have always been a premium access product. You've always had to pay for them. So I think those two worlds might start to collide in different ways, not only for listeners, but for retailers and possibly publishers as well, who I imagine everyone's looking at short form content in different ways, because I think as the audio market grows out and grows beyond that kind of core market of maybe more traditional book readers who have been fans of audiobooks for so long, but there's an influx every year of new audiobook listeners who don't consider themselves traditional readers in any sense or form. So I think it's kind of interesting, and I'm sure we're going to hear from Ruth and Elise about how publishers are responding to that. I think that's really fascinating. I'll mention Spotify again and streaming services, because that's, I think, where some of the collision is happening. And you know, we all know Spotify as a music service, but they've invested so much in spoken word, buying podcast companies and platforms, and they've made some quite bold predictions that they think in the near to medium future, 20% of all consumption on Spotify will not come from music. So that's, I think, an opportunity for publishers in terms of reaching different audiences and huge audiences. And I think finally, I would say that I know, of course, there are challenges around audiobooks. There are challenges around everything to do with audio is a little bit different from other kinds of publishing. And of course, we've got my fellow panelists who are you know, experienced audio publishers, but not everyone is yet. And I know there are publishers who are still trying to figure out how to do audio publishing successfully. I think there's been, of course, a long tradition of selling audio rights to other audio publishers who have had experience of that. But I would also always really encourage publishers to think if now might not be a good time to actually invest in their own publishing strategy and publishing directly in audio, because as that market grows, the kind of mid-list titles that might have been difficult to publish 5, 6, 7 years ago, even when I was at Penguin Random House, are now not so difficult to publish because the audience is so much bigger. So I think I want to kind of end on an optimistic note, which is, I think there's probably never been a better time to be an audio publisher than now.
Thank you so much, Videl, and really interesting points there as well. I think particularly as when we've been in this situation with lockdown, where you're having to use technology so much more and adapt, I thought that was really interesting what you were saying about Spotify and streaming services and 20% of all consumption not coming from music. I think that could be a really interesting area as we all adapt to the kind of current climate as well, in a way that none of us could have anticipated, really. So I'm going to move on to Ruth and look forward to hearing what you have to say, Ruth.
So thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. As Louise said, I work at Bookouture, which is a digital publishing company. We've been going for 7 years and have sold over 35 million ebooks. And I thought I would explain the sort of current shape of our audio publishing and also talk a bit more about some things that might come next. So to sort of copy what everyone else has said here, we have seen amazing growth. To put that in perspective, in 2015, we only published 4 audiobooks, and last year we published nearly 300, and we've seen sort of double-digit revenue growth every year, which looks set to continue. Like Videl, I'm coming at it from a slightly sort of more international perspective. We publish all our books globally, and the US audiobook market is definitely more developed than the UK still. Obviously, it's a larger market with more people, but also it's further along in terms of how many people listen to audio, and that's definitely reflected in our sales. Our publishing overall sort of skews towards the US. Over 50% of our sales come from there, but in audio that rises to 70%, and that's been pretty consistent. So although the UK market is growing, we're still sort of seeing the biggest numbers coming from the US. The other thing that's sort of interesting about Bookouture and a bit different is that our demographic is quite different to what the research says about the sort of average audiobook listener, particularly in the UK. So I know the sort of latest Nielsen data shows that more women are getting into audiobooks, but you know, there's still a sort of huge proportion of people who are sort of young and urban and male, which and listening to non-fiction, which doesn't sort of totally skew with like publishing as a whole. And although Bookouture launched a non-fiction list in May, we otherwise publish very commercial fiction. And what we know about our readers, the sort of the people who follow us on Facebook, etc., is that they're likely to be female and over 50. So the fact that we've seen such significant growth still indicates to me that there's a huge audience out there ready to be converted, and who may be coming to audio sort of via ebooks and getting into just reading differently in a different format or listening, rather than maybe coming via podcasts or sort of other audio content. Bookouture was founded by a man called Oliver Rhodes, and he said that he feels the audio market is developing similarly to what happened with ebooks and digital to begin with. So you have the earliest adopters who are younger, tech savvy, more likely to be men. And as the market matures, you sort of get people coming in who are sort of more voracious readers, who at the moment still tend to be older women. So I think there's a lot of room to expand across all sort of age ranges. But I would sort of second what Videl says, which is it's also great that there's a sort of younger generation of men and women getting into books in a slightly different format, because that's something that publishing has always struggled with. In terms of the genres we publish in, like the overall market, we do best with crime and thriller. And that's true particularly when it comes to ongoing backlist sales. There are some territory differentials. Historical fiction is much bigger in the US than UK, and there's a real sort of obvious split in women's fiction. So like funny chick lit does really well in the UK, and sort of sweet romance and more emotional women's fiction does better in the US. What we've seen over the past few years, though, is that those sort of more stereotypically female genres have definitely started becoming more profitable in ways that they weren't to begin with, which I think for me is a further sign that the audience is kind of changing and shifting and growing, and that people who wouldn't have considered listening to an audiobook a few years ago are definitely now kind of making it a regular part of the way they consume content. Most of our books sell through subscription models or whisper sync sales. That's not broken down, but that's what we think. And I think the other interesting thing about our publishing is our ebooks are priced quite low compared to the rest of the market, particularly in the US. So I know there's a lot of sort of discussion around sort of audiobook pricing. And I think particularly for us, our audiobooks would look expensive in comparison, which indicates that there's a really sort of devoted market who see the value in them. And I think another thing we're probably all aware of is a much longer tail with audiobooks. I think in terms of some of the sort of bigger retailers, there's still work to be done in terms of like recommendation and discoverability. But it's definitely true that older books sell on steadily in audio in a way that they often don't with our digital publishing, or that with our ebooks it needs to be sort of driven by promotions, and that's not true in audio. I think sort of thinking about the lockdown, we haven't seen sort of a huge shift in listening patterns, but I think, you know, the world has been strange and quite stressful for a bit longer than the last few months. And what we have seen in terms of our publishing is a rise in historical fiction sales. So stories of people dealing with previous sort of difficult or dark times. And on the more escapist side, cozy crime as well. Like Louise said at the beginning, our sales have continued to increase during lockdown, sort of not at an exponential rate, but I sort of feel like there are probably some consumers who are buying less because they're not commuting as much. So I think it basically sort of shows what we all know, that there's still kind of inherent market growth that isn't going to slow down anytime soon. So looking forward, I'm really excited to see where the market goes. Like I said, we've just started publishing non-fiction, and we're looking to expand our team, sort of focus more on audio-led commissioning, which could mean sort of expanding into different genres, or doing different things with the formats, like multicast sort of narration or serialization, or looking at short form content as well. I know there are sort of a ton of different providers or sales models globally. You can see sort of platforms like Serialbox or Luminary for podcasts. And I think there's an increased focus in how books can be reformatted to audio, like cookbooks or textbooks or travel writing or education publishing generally. So I think, as well as sort of finding new ways to convert kind of existing sort of physical book content for the audio market, we're also going to see sort of increased experimentations in like audio native projects, which I think is really exciting. And also things like sort of interactive storytelling for kids or for adults. And I know there are a few people sort of developing things that use Alexa, and I just think there's sort of lots of different ways that the market could go. The other thing I'm just fascinated by is whether we'll see sort of AI narration and translation, and whether that can develop to the point where it can replace human voices and human translators. I don't think it's there yet, but I think given sort of the way those tools are evolving, I wouldn't say it can't ever happen. And I think it'd be really interesting to see what that means for audio and the entertainment industry as a whole. I think one thing it will do is just mean there'll be a kind of absolutely massive increase in content. I can imagine a world in which you can kind of pick the sort of narrator you want, or the style you want, or sort of try out different narrators until you find one you like. But I think that will also bring challenges in terms of sort of discoverability and curation and piracy and sort of the different places that we sell our content. I think I agree with what you said, Louise, earlier. I think the sort of barriers about the different formats are going to break down, and it will increasingly be about just sort of selling stories, and giving people a range of options for how to consume them, including kind of jumping from one element to the other in the way that WhisperSync already does, rather than thinking of sort of physical digital audio as completely separate things. And I will leave it there, and I look forward to questions later.
Oh, that's brilliant, Ruth. Thank you so much for going into detail with that. I'm sure, I mean, I was amazed at that. I thought that was so brilliant. I was jotting down my own kind of thoughts on that because it was so interesting. And also, yes, with the formats breaking down and kind of looking at storytelling in different ways, and seeing how we get that kind of IA narration coming in too, just to kind of keep up with the boom of everything. I completely agree. I could see that happening. And I think even in the sense of viewing things in a different way, how illustrated books perhaps might not have seemed appropriate for audio, and now that's really being explored. I think that's also indicative of how the industry is growing. And that actually brings me quite neatly on to Elise, who'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. Thanks so much for that, Elise.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, so as Louise mentioned earlier, I started in the retail side of things and moved over to the publishing side of things, which I think has given me quite a unique perspective on the audio world. So when I started at Audible in 2013, there wasn't that much content on the site. We were still sort of saying to publishers, please do more, please turn more of your frontlist books as well as your backlist books into unabridged audio. The market's there, customers are asking for more, and we really think this is going somewhere. And in the 5 years I was at Audible, I mean, we went from saying to publishers, you need to be doing more, to saying, oh my gosh, we're running out of space on the homepage. There are so many great titles coming through, which is what led Dorling Kindersley to start producing their own audio. So we actually only launched last year. That's what they brought me in to do. And within 6 months, we were sort of up and running. We managed to do 25 audiobooks last year. We're aiming to do around 100 books this year, and who knows in the future how many more we will be doing. Last year was mostly backlist, while we were sort of figuring out how we could adapt the books to audio, because again, anyone who knows a Dorling Kindersley book, they're quite heavily illustrated. They're very beautiful to look at, which is not the most convenient audio read. It's not, you don't necessarily start at the beginning of the page and read all the way to the end of the page, but you'll have a diagram and some image text and a text box. So currently, when we're choosing our titles, we have that in mind, and we're very aware that at this point in time, not everything is adaptable for audio. It would take a level of editorial work that we can't manage at this time. For the titles that we are doing, I will have a good look at it and sort of come up with a rough adaptation format and sort of say, this type of content should be read first, for example, with quotes or facts. Text boxes can fit in somewhere into the main body of the text. And then I will sort of leave it down to the studios that we're working with to format everything properly. So between the producers and the sound engineers and the editors and the narrators, they will read through the content and say, actually, when we're reading this out loud, it makes more sense for the quotes to come last instead of first, or something like that. The studios that we've been working with have been incredible. And to echo Louise, in lockdown as well, I mean, we were blown away by the fact that we didn't really have to move any of the audiobooks. There were a number of narrators that had home setups, or studios able to manage with the narrators that either we'd already cast, or the odd title that we have pushed back so that we can keep the same narrator if they couldn't work from home, which has been incredible. And hopefully we've been able to support the narrators as much as the studios have been supporting us. What we've seen currently is that a number of our, again, because we're still sort of in our first year of audio, we're able to be quite experimental with the titles that we're choosing, the genres that we're going for. And again, I'm currently going based on my knowledge of my time at Audible, looking at things like the philosophy, psychology, self-help, true crime, history, business titles on the non-fiction side, as well as a number of other genres that we have. But as well as there being this demand for more audiobooks in general, there was always a very big demand for non-fiction specifically. I think the weight is still very, very much fiction over non-fiction, but it's definitely growing. But yes, it means we're able to be a bit more experimental with the kind of titles we're choosing, the length of the audiobook. And we've seen, so a couple of the titles that have been doing well for us, World History title, Books That Change History, and A Complete Idiot's Guide to Psychology. And then on the biography side, which is mostly non-brainer, especially if the author is able to narrate themselves. We did IMC 3PO, The Inside Story, at the end of last year, which was also great for the release of the last Star Wars film. Down to Earth by Monty Don. And we also did the story of my experiments with truth, which is the Gandhi autobiography for his 150th anniversary. And we worked very close with the DK India team for that release. So in terms of looking at what's going on in world events and being adaptable and picking titles to reflect what's going on, or that can link in with certain big events, we're definitely paying attention to that. And equally, as with all audiobooks, if all you've got is what you're listening to, we're being very careful with the narrators we choose. So to echo what Ruth said, DK is a global company. And I've seen one of the questions somebody asked was, does that mean that we will cast differently? I mean, if your biggest marketplace is the US, I guess, do you choose a British narrator over an American narrator? My personal preference, as a British person is generally British. And for the most part, I don't think it necessarily matters, especially with our content, because it's non-fiction. There's no sort of voices to have to worry about. But we definitely do cast American or Canadian narrators. And again, we've done quite a few with Irish narrators, depending on the content. For true crime in particular, they seem to work quite well. So I'm having quite a lot of fun with the casting side of things, which was not my job at Audible, but something that I had lots of discussions with publishers about and with the Audible team. So it's been quite interesting to see how you can pair up a narrator with the content that you have. We've also been able to do things like we've done a How to Be a Mindful Drinker title, where it had a bit of a podcast feel as well as the main narration, because there were a few authors on the book. And again, Dorling Kindersley doesn't necessarily have an author with the content, which on the one hand makes things easy for us for the adaptation side. But on the other hand, where we do have an author, we will explore whether they want to narrate themselves and have the discussion about how they might want to do that. And those narrators in particular wanted it to have a bit more of a podcast feel to reflect the social side of the book. And I think that worked really well. We've started doing a couple more children's titles. Again, mostly non-fiction, although we do have the odd fiction title. We've seen what it would be like to include sound design or music, which again, I personally don't think is a necessity for audiobooks. That might be slightly different on the children's side of things. And we are trying both, and we'll see what works, hopefully at a slightly later date. And then we've got things like the Big Ideas Simply Explained series. We've done roughly 20 of those that seem to be working really well. They cross a huge number of genres and topics, and it makes for really interesting productions, shall we say, especially with the adaptation side of things. So again, I think audio is still very much growing. There's still a lot that we could be doing. I think people are still sort of looking into how you could do a cookery title, for example. If you've got a huge number of recipes, how can you listen to that that's still going to be engaging? If you're in the middle of trying to cook, how can you do that while listening? I don't have the answer to that. If anyone does, please let me know. We have plenty of those going on the physical list. And I'm very excited to see in the next 10 years where audio will be.
Amazing, thank you so much, Elise. And again, so interesting. And a kind of overall, what the kind of message that I'm sort of getting, kind of listening to Ruth and Videl and Elise there, is looking at the international side of things. Like, you know, as Videl touched on, that US market, 25% year on year is kind of a staggering figure. But the way it seems to happen is that often it is the US kind of slightly ahead in that way. And also that experimentation as well that Ruth touched on, that Elise has touched on, with, you know, seeing if music works in particular audiobooks, whether it has more of an impact on children's. And now's really the time to be doing that, to be looking further afield and to be experimenting with the titles that we have. So we've had a lot of questions that have come in, but I'm going to just touch in with Suzanne there on that.
Yeah, I've tried to collate them for you. Hopefully, some I think have been answered already. So thanks to the panel for that.
Brilliant. And so lovely to see as well what the turnout has been like on this. It's kind of, and seeing the kind of questions come in as well, I'm kind of nodding along to so many of them, because I'm like, yeah, that's a really interesting point. There's sort of different things on there that really would be lovely to go into further detail about. And also what I've been I'm so pleased as well, just to also say, I'm sure I will be saying thank you later as well, but Videl, Elise and Ruth, thank you so much for doing this, because all three of you who brought such different perspectives to this conversation, that is really just so illuminating for me. You know, personally, I work at Little Brown, I work across all fiction, non-fiction titles, and yet the perspectives that you've managed to feed into this conversation are different to, you know, so many areas of what I do, and how everyone has those different approaches, and also building the audio market in this way, because I do think that, you know, building it for that longevity, because as we touched on with Elise, you know, with the reader being quite subjective, you might not necessarily like a US voice. You might prefer, the dulcet tones of an Irishman reading you a crime thriller, or reading you true crime. I don't blame you, but it does really, it's where all of the publishers and all of the people who work within audio, we all are kind of indebted to each other to produce as high quality audiobooks as we possibly can, because we have listening readers coming into this market. And while you may pick up a book and not enjoy it for whatever reason, then you will still, we're all readers here, you'll still pick up another book. If you pick up an audiobook and you've never experienced one, and for whatever reason that quality isn't up to scratch, then you're probably not going to continue a subscription. You're probably not going to pick up another audiobook. So in order to explore all of these different areas, it is that experimentation, it is testing the market, it is being aware of where we can develop things further. And that innovation is just so key to where we are. And exactly what Videl said as well, that this is a once in a generation shift. So so it's great to be doing that. Great. I'm just seeing if Suzanne, have you got the questions together there?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So we've got a first question from, she said, there's so many. So Jessica Cropper asked, do you see a market for non-fiction audio in the future? At the moment, it seems to be mostly focused on fiction books. Who'd like to take that first? I don't know. Louise, who do you think should take that one first?
Oh, interesting. Let's start with Elise, and then Ruth, you can feed into that as well with your very exciting new area as well.
Well, as I mentioned again, especially from my time at Audible, looking at the number of audiobooks available and the split between fiction and non-fiction, you're correct, it's still very much fiction-based. I think publishers are still sort of possibly playing safe with the fiction over the non-fiction, because an audiobook is not the cheapest thing to create necessarily, and I don't actually know anymore what the listening stats are in terms of the split. I think it's still very much heavier on the fiction side to the non-fiction, but I do think non-fiction is coming. And when you look at the bestsellers on Audible, for example, the majority of the time, the top 20 will be much more heavily skewed towards non-fiction than fiction. Obviously, I'm currently at a publishing house where the majority of what I'm publishing is non-fiction. It's the most I've ever read of non-fiction or listened to of non-fiction, and I'm learning so much, and it is fascinating. I know quite a few people that will always say they would prefer to listen to non-fiction because they would physically prefer to read fiction. And I also think in terms of the listeners that you get, they're generally people who are entertainment consumers, so they will already be reading a physical or an ebook as well as listening to audio. So I think that there's still a lot to do on the non-fiction side, but I definitely think it's growing.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, and I think one of the reasons, I mean, Bookouture launched a sort of non-fiction list because it was an area of the market that we weren't involved in, but I think sort of the audio potential there is huge. I think there's something in sort of looking back at my last job at Hodder, which was a trade sort of fiction non-fiction publisher, particularly sort of celebrity or expert kind of books where you have that direct link between, you know, either the celebrity's voice or sort of the expert kind of explaining something to you. There's a sort of real personal connection there that's particularly kind of obvious in the audio space. I also think that the pattern of sort of audio sales in terms of backlist makes a big difference. I think sort of non-fiction audio sort of sells on for a really long time because, you know, people are looking for specific topics or stories in that space, and there's no kind of time limit to when you can go and discover those.
That was really interesting, and there's just a follow-up question from Amy Hayden that I think might be relevant. She was asking about non-fiction, but also about discoverability. So I guess it's, you know, what's discoverability of non-fiction like, or how do you go about it? I know, Videl, I don't know if you have any views on that, or Ruth or Elise, if you want to pick up on that.
I mean, I think in terms of sort of discoverability, I would say some audio sites sort of aren't quite as good at it as the big sort of Amazon, you know, in terms of sort of, if you like this, you'll also like this. I think it's a little bit behind at the moment, is my impression as a sort of someone who listens rather than someone who publishes. But I think in terms of sort of our publishing, a lot of the original discoverability seems to come from the initial publication. So people kind of see the marketing we're doing for the ebook and the audio simultaneously and will kind of pick their format. But my instinct is that people are just kind of browsing very actively and looking for books. I think there's a lot more we could be doing as publishers to publicize sort of audio as a format. I think that's been, you know, I think sort of some publishers are very focused on the print edition as the sort of big splashy thing, and sort of let the audio kind of sell organically. And I think there will be a kind of a big shift in terms of how seriously people take the format and how much they're trying to sell it actively to consumers.
I completely agree with that. And I also think my experience on the publishing side working with retailers is that you know, there are a lot of features and sales that go on, but most of the time what I'm seeing are fiction options. So I don't have titles that I can put forward for that, and there will be the odd non-fiction option, but it's still quite rare, and I guess that is to do with the fact that there's a lot less content available. The other thing that I'm generally thinking about, just to go back, when I'm casting narrators, is what else they've narrated, because on occasion you might decide you like a narrator and therefore you'll listen to something else they've narrated, and that won't necessarily be within the same genre that you've just listened to. So in terms of, I mean, the algorithms on a number of the retailer sites just do nothing for me because I listen, as the poll showed earlier, quite eclectically. So I think that also adds to it.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that. Thank you. Suzanne, what's the...
Well, so we had a couple of questions. I think Meg and Marina had asked about illustrators in DK, which I think probably Elise has covered off a lot of that. So I just wanted to acknowledge we saw your questions. But Emily Lawrence asked how audio might work in education. And as we're talking about different genres, what do people think about that?
That's really interesting, because I originally sort of came from sort of more of an ELT side of things and kind of going down the more podcasting route with that and sitting in on recordings for sort of young educational listeners. But I think things probably have moved on quite a bit since I was last doing that. So if anyone would like to take that one.
Well, all I can say, I can say just anecdotally that you know, I've been having some conversations with some academic publishers, so including, you know, ELT, diverse publishing programs, and I think it seems to me they're thinking about audio more and more, and I think that might be another wave that we haven't seen yet in terms of a whole area of publishing that will move to audio and maybe have to do things in a slightly different way, but still fit and adapt to audio listening.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Videl. Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. That's great.
Do you want to take another question? So Ruby Walker has asked, I think, a very prescient question. What are publishing houses doing to make audiobooks available to a range of socio-economic backgrounds?
I think that's a really prevalent question, actually, and one that's very much on a lot of people's minds. Just to quite slightly touch on this, some people may have heard of the Axe the Reading Tax campaign. The reading tax has been axed for ebooks, which is great, and I think a lot of people don't actually realise that is still an issue for audio. So I may I'll start with Videl, but I think everyone's going to have a feeling on this, absolutely. So I'll go to Videl first.
Oh, well, I mean, the thing that just comes to, if you mention taxation, I think, yeah, and that's an incredibly important one aspect. I know that the sales tax on audiobooks in Germany is 9%. It's not 0, but it's 9%, and it's not 20. So I think I would fully support that. And I'm sure the other panelists would also agree that of course libraries are incredibly important, not in the UK, but in, you know, so many markets. And always think about the US as having a huge and important and thriving library market, but the UK in terms of audio, and I think the UK does as well, and maybe just needs much better promotion. And yeah, I don't know what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, I agree about the sort of the importance of the library market. I think as the market develops, you know, as we sell more books, it will become more sort of cost effective in terms of, you know, having they're quite expensive to produce, but the more we sell, the sort of more that offsets. So as the market gets bigger, you know, I think there'll be possibly a pressure on prices to come down, or different sort of retailers will try different kind of streaming models, or the ways that people pay for audiobooks. I think that will change. The other thing I think that doesn't get talked about a lot and comes back to sort of casting narrators. I think there's a dearth of narrators who come from sort of more diverse backgrounds or different sort of socioeconomic backgrounds. I mean, I don't know if you've listened to audiobooks, but the narrators all tend to sound sort of very middle class, and you know, like I have published audiobooks where we've really struggled to find a good narrator who kind of sounds genuinely like they come from London, or you know, from different backgrounds. So I think that's something as well that we should be mindful of. Like, I think it's not where it should be in terms of representation, which is sort of linked to the whole problem of representation in publishing generally. I think sort of as the market develops over the next few years, you'll see more kind of library content, but you'll probably also see different ways of paying for and consuming content, which will, I think, reduce some of those barriers to entry as well.
No, absolutely. No, I definitely agree with that, and I think, yeah, I mean, definitely the conversations around publishing recently and the diversity of that is really prevalent again, and I think the more that we get more titles and more authors and voices coming into the market, I think that will also sort of help that along as well. Yes, I can see a few questions about people who are sort of interested in getting into audio publishing. I can see a few that sort of seem to vary on kind of sort of how you would suggest kind of getting into audio publishing. If anybody would like to answer that, I mean, my kind of feeling is that from getting into audio publishing, that everyone kind of comes in from like a really eclectic way, and I don't think there's like one way in which that you get into audio publishing. I don't also think it's necessarily, you don't necessarily have to have a master's, from my experience, and I think so many different areas, if you've come from rights, for example, or sales or somewhere else, is so applicable to audio. But I don't know if anyone would like to take that question.
Yeah, I think I don't think there's a sort of single way to get into audio publishing. In fact, I think, you know, there are so many different ways for audio content to be brought to readers. You know, you could be working like in radio, or for Audible, or for a podcast company, or sort of look to kind of for jobs being advertised, or sort of internships. I think as long as you're sort of curious about it and take and research, there's many more sort of opportunities in audio, I think, beyond kind of big publishing houses, and so I hope that, you know, there are lots of different routes in.
Yeah, absolutely, great.
So there's a couple of questions I think are really interesting. So Vicky has asked about, why do you think the change in demographics have happened? I know we touched on some of those points earlier. And then there's a really interesting question from Ruth Stitt about, it would be interesting to know how many people finish the audiobooks they read, or are a lot partly read. So I guess a bit of a, yeah, what do we know? And then really though, tell me.
It's funny you mentioned that, actually, because when I was sort of doing a little bit of reading ahead of this talk, I did find a statistic from a few years ago where it kind of seemed to indicate that this came from the US market, and this was like, I think at Future Book maybe a few years ago, where it seemed to indicate that if you listen to podcasts and you listen to audiobooks, you were more likely to finish the audiobook. I'm not actually sure who said that now, but whether that's something, but there's definitely ways in which you can track listening in a similar way. I guess that's done with Kindle as well. Anyone like to, maybe Elise, would you like to take that one?
I'm not sure those stats have ever been shared. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody else knows, but I think that's probably very much retailer specific and not something that they tend to share. I think it's very different to other types of entertainment. So I think, if you start watching something, you're more likely to finish it, especially if it's a film over a TV series. I don't know about audio. And again, obviously, I personally, if I start listening to something, the likelihood is I'm going to finish it. But that's the same if I start reading a book, I'm going to finish it. So I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you on that. And I think, yeah, when I think back to that statistic now, it kind of seems it seems strange. But yeah, it's kind of came more from the US, looking at their podcast market. Yes.
What about the demographic aspect of it? Why, is it purely down to our current situation, or, Videl, I guess this might be one for you. Where do you see the trends?
I'm not sure specifically. I think there's so many different moving parts to this whole change in demographic. How much of it is influenced by retailers and what kind of campaigns they're doing, what's the publishing mix in every given year, are there standout non-fiction books in a particular year that bring different audiences in. I think there's so many different things happening. It's very fluid. Those are my only thoughts at the moment. I just think that I keep thinking that more people are discovering audio all the time, so year on year it's growing. And why is that? It's not just because the same number of people are consuming more audio, more people are coming to audio. So I think by its nature, when you have a market that's growing, you'd hope that the audience just diversifies as it gets bigger. But I'm not sure how that might. You feel free to challenge that.
Go on.
Sorry.
I think there's also been quite a lot more marketing on audiobooks as well. I've definitely seen a lot more, and I don't know if that's just because I'm more aware of it or I'm looking for it. But I'd never, again, before I started working at Audible, I'd never really thought about audio as a format. I'd never seen any kind of advertising for it. And obviously, being somewhere like Audible where you're working on those kinds of things all the time, I became very aware of it. But I remember the day that I found out I was going to be working at Audible, I turned the TV on and saw my first advert for Audible. And I'd never seen anything to do with audio before. And since then, there's a lot more of it, which really helps.
I do think Audible have been great at really pushing the format of audiobooks as well, because I think that's been one of the things that we touched on, that it is a little bit of a it is a bit of an uphill battle to kind of make consumers aware that this entire format is available to them. And I do think, the tube ads, the Juliet Stevenson doing anything just has me. So I do think they've been fantastic in that way and really bringing that awareness to consumers. Definitely agree with you there.
Right, we've probably got time for one or two more questions. And Ruth, did you drop out?
Sorry, my internet crashed. I apologise.
I'm impressed. I've never seen the internet get back up working that quickly again. Brilliant. I thought you.
I'm on 4G now.
Yeah, me too. Country living. We've really. I think we've only got a couple of minutes left. There was, I'm going to name check Louise Richardson. She'd asked about our thoughts about the Fourth Estate publishing the Mirror and the Light edition split into 30-minute segments and an adaptation in 30-minute episodes. And she was sort of interested to know what you think. There's that question, but there's also another one I wanted to flag because I think that will have a lot of meaning to the BookMachine community. Is Catalina has asked, what opportunities do you think there are for very small or new indie publishers who want to branch out into indie audiobooks, because the market seems to be currently dominated by larger or more established publishers. So I don't know, Louise, if you want to suggest one person take one question and maybe one or two people take another question, but I think we'll have to wrap it after those.
Yeah, absolutely. The Mirror and Light, just to touch on that, Of course, I've not personally published that myself, so I don't know what the publishing decisions are around that, but I do think it's an interesting one to kind of split things into segments in that way. And from my understanding as well, I think they also had an abridged version, which was kind of in a bundle with 2 other original books, plus then having the full length version as well. And I think that is smart publishing to make that accessibility for such a big title. Videl, would you like to kind of touch that on?
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether if people remember how, you know, before, well, years ago in audiobook publishing, everything was abridged, and of course now that's seen as a kind of very antiquated and unnecessary thing because everything is digital. But I wonder if there might be, in some sort of strange way, a hybrid return to not exactly abridgment, but kind of a short form version of a book that might meet a slightly different audience needs. I'm thinking about podcast audiences who are still discovering audiobooks but might not have time. You know, there might be a non-fiction book that might be 20 hours long, but essentially the author might think there's still value in their arguments being boiled down into, you know, 5 times 30 episodes or something like that. And that might still be considered an audiobook. Possibly.
There's a really interesting company called Blinkist, which people probably have heard of, which does sort of abridged non-fiction, sort of big idea books, but done very short. So yeah, I don't know, like we've found if people want the book, they want the whole book, but that might change.
So has anyone got any final thoughts about how can smaller indie publishers start?
Well, I mean, when Bookouture started, it was a small indie publisher. It's now part of Hachette, but it wasn't up until sort of 2.5 years ago, I think. That was before my time, so I'm not entirely clear on the date. And that was one of the reasons that sort of audio was slower to develop, and it took a while for us to do more audiobooks. But I think, you know, you have an option to sublicense to audio companies if you don't want to sort of do the production yourself. Equally, in terms of sort of getting the funds together, you know, it helps to publish audiobooks simultaneously with the other publications, but it's not essential. So if you're thinking about kind of cash flow, waiting until you kind of can afford it or can test whether you think there's a market for that book, which could translate into the audio, is possible too. And I think in terms of discoverability, you know, it's the same for audio as it is for the other publishing that you're doing. So it's all kind of part and parcel. And if you can kind of reach your audience with digital, you should be able to reach the audience with the audio as well. Like, I think whatever else we can say about sort of Amazon and Audible, they're very democratic. And, you know, people can find books on there in a variety of different ways.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to have to be the school mum and draw things to a close, but we could honestly, I apologise to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. I mean, you could go on and on. I just need to say a huge thank you to our brilliant host, Louise. As you can tell, she's brilliant. Queen audio. Sorry, Louise. And then also to Elise, Ruth and Videl, who have been amazing. Thanks for your candour, for sharing your insights and experience. It's really appreciated, and you'll see in the chat how everyone has enjoyed it. I also want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight, over 100 of you. Thank you so much for coming along, getting involved, asking questions and chatting. And I know we've had people in from Athens, Frankfurt, Oxford, Portsmouth and more. So we love the fact that it's bringing people together from quite literally all over the world. And I hope to see you all soon. Take care, stay safe and keep talking. Thank you. Bye-bye.